There's a lot of different schools of thought when it comes to IT operations. In the past, we had a very rigid way that we used to operate our environments. And there's this concept called Waterfall. So Waterfall is an example of a design approach that was really focused on a very sequential or rigid process. This has been around since about the 50s. So when software and applications first started coming into being, the early programmers and developers, they didn't really have a way to be able to figure out how they needed to develop software. So what did they do? They looked around and they looked at the construction industry. So in the case of the construction industry, they were able to look at an example where they had a pretty rigid and a very well-structured way of being able to deliver, a new building or an architectural project. But in the case of these type of environments, it was very sequential. In other words, you'd have to build the first floor, then you'd build the second floor, then you'd build the third floor. But guess what? If you needed to make a change on the first floor, that was going to be very painful. You'd either have to bulldoze the building or you'd have to do something, really extreme in order to be able to make those changes happen. So this is something that you typically saw in the way networks were designed, in the way that the data center environments as well as applications were being designed. This was something that really, focused more on requirements and scope, where the requirements and the analysis and the design was done first, and it was very rigid. And if you went outside of that, it was going to be very difficult. But in the case of developing software, you really didn't even get to the point of actually doing any coding until you did all this documentation and design and research. What's the biggest challenge here? This stuff took forever to do. So when you start to think about what's changed, is we've moved into more of an agile environment where software and development is being done in a way that's very different from these type of examples. Right? We're not trying to follow that same very rigid and unstructured or structured approach. We're trying to be able to move faster and be a lot more efficient to deliver value to our customers. So one of the things that really changed is this concept of lean. So we think about where lean came from, as lean is really a concept that came out of the development of the Japanese auto industry. So after World War II, there was a lot of rebuilding that had to happen, and the Japanese auto industry, were looking for ways to be able to create efficiency in their process. So the Toyota production system was one of the first examples of really providing this concept of lean. Taiichi Ohno in 1988 wrote a book called Just-in-Time Manufacturing. This is something that really changed the way that organizations viewed how to be able to run their environments. And one of the prime quotes that he used to deliver in this book was the concept that costs don't exist to be calculated, costs exist to be reduced. So the idea is it's not just to be able to calculate the cost, but we need to find active ways to be able to reduce the amount of wasted effort in our organizations. This was introduced in the West in 1991 through a book called The Machine That Changed the World. And this was a book that really started to ignite a fire in organizations and businesses to be able to deliver something called a lean management philosophy, where the idea was to reduce waste and eliminate waste across all aspects of business. So what this means is when we start to think about what customers are requiring today and what our customers, ultimately our end customers, are requiring, is they're requiring that our business moves much, much faster. So each one of you, if you've got a CEO, they're beating the drum that you've got to move faster, because if you don't, the competition's going to leave you behind. Ultimately, customers want to be able to get value and they want to get it quickly. And to be able to provide things like innovation, you've got to be able to move fast and be able to deliver new services. Imagine if you had an application that you bought on your smartphone and it didn't get updated on a regular basis, you would drop that thing like a bad habit. At the end of the day, it's all about continuing to add value to the customer and moving faster. And the only way to make that happen is to operate in a much more efficient way, because ultimately these applications are transforming businesses. So we talked before about the application not just being a support aspect of the business, but really driving new business models, as well as being able to get the business closer to the customer. Back to that example of the smartphone. That is one of the first mechanisms that the business has to be able to engage tightly with their customer. Plus all the analytics they can get out of it. At the end of the day, those applications are absolutely transforming businesses. So what's the holdup? We hear a lot about this desire to move faster and all these kind of things, but at the end of the day, our infrastructure and our operating models are really what the challenges are. They're very rigid. We talked before about that waterfall approach. Being able to make a change in your typical data center environment today is extremely difficult. If you walk into a data center and start unplugging cables, people will absolutely lose their minds. Why? Because the environment is fragile. You've got a situation where it's set up, it's ready, it's operating, but if you make changes, there can be a cascade effect that can have very detrimental ramifications to applications that are running in there. So you need an environment that's less fragile, and that's again something that we've got to be able to address, and we can leverage cloud technologies to make it happen. In addition, in security. Where do security issues come into play? When things go off the rails, when you start having, one-off scenarios where, one engineer has a very different way of being able to deploy a security policy than another. And that inconsistency is what hackers love, because they can take advantage of those things to be able to get access and be able to, to break into your network in a lot of cases. But ultimately, again, it comes down to that fact that there's not standardization and templatization. And that's something that we can address in a cloud environment. It's one of the core tenets. We'll talk more about that later. But ultimately, network complexity is going to dictate app deployment as well as the operational model. So by moving away from a more rigid and fragile environment, we have the ability to be able to move faster in a lot of cases. So how are organizations addressing this? Well, at the end of the day, IT can't just throw out all the existing operational model processes. It's got to be able to continue to run the business. And in a lot of cases, you've got some very sensitive applications. For example, your accounting system, it's a system of record. If you're a publicly traded company and your accounting system is not up to snuff, you're going to have some real challenges with the SEC if you're in the case of the U.S. These are situations where you've got to be able to continue to support those applications in a consistent way. But the business needs to be able to move faster. It's requiring that IT organizations do more with less. So one way that is really becoming popular out there to be able to address some of these challenges is a term that Gartner has coined called bimodal IT strategy. And what this means is a lot of organizations are looking to be able to continue to run their traditional operating models. They're leveraging these capabilities they've built up over years, the different capabilities and operational models that they've been, using and are in practice and have a solid understanding of. But they're also spinning up another environment that's really focused on innovation and being able to drive, new capabilities and leveraging automation and things like that. Ultimately, it's a way to be able to start, utilizing these capabilities today without having to basically throw everything away and start over. Bimodal IT is just one method of being able to address this issue. It's not a perfect example because ultimately you're building two different environments. You've got two different, operational models, and it can in some cases be difficult to be able to work together, but it's one way that we're seeing a lot of companies are using to be able to get that innovation and that speed that their business is requiring. In addition, when we start thinking about the future of IT operations, ultimately it's all about having a fully programmable, cloud-driven IT environment. And we want that IT environment to be focused on really three things: agility, the ability to be able to move quickly and be able to turn on a dime; flexibility, in that I have the capabilities of trying new things and innovating. I've got an environment that doesn't dictate what type of applications I can put in it, and really is something that's going to be able to meet the needs of the business much quicker. And lower operational effort. We've got to reduce the challenges associated with it. Why? Because that equals money. That equals cost. When you think about how many people are focused on doing things, within your organization that are repetitive or things that, could be automated, those are prime examples of ways to be able to reduce cost with cloud-based technologies. And then ultimately, IT needs to be aligned to the business needs, not the other way around. The business shouldn't be held hostage to the capabilities IT has, but by aligning IT to the business needs and leveraging some of these different capabilities we'll talk about throughout this lesson, you'll see where this is a capability and an effort that is very well understood in these environments. Leveraging cloud is something that can make this stuff happen.